And I was taking the pictures, and if the bang came...
Oh, sorry. I keep leaving it in the way.
Get those off by 0200, please.
And West went on making notes.
Good night.
Good night.
After a while, it gets routine, and your heart doesn't even go.
Agent Topaz's intelligence was unique, and the Soviets were hungry for more. He responded by gaining access to the most secret document in NATO. It was called MC-161.
And it was cosmic top secret, which was the highest level of classification. You had to read it in the registry. You couldn't take it to your office. It was for eyes only.
Did you photograph it?
Yeah, I photographed it in its entirety, which was quite a lot of work. And I'm not going to tell you how.
The MC-161 was guarded so closely because it contained the crown jewels of NATO's intelligence. It was not a battle plan, but a detailed account of everything the Soviets knew about NATO.
If you know what your enemy knows about you, you know, for instance, that he ignores the strengths is there and that he ignores your weakness somewhere else, I mean, it's a tremendous advantage.
Throughout 1983, Rainer Rupp kept the Soviets informed about NATO's intentions using a prearranged system.
I always said that there was not the kind of big plan to attack the Soviet Union at 12 o'clock tomorrow type of thing, because the European governments just wouldn't have participated, especially not the German government, because they would have been, if not completely destroyed, but to a large degree also destroyed. But all this talk of the Reagan administration, yes, I do think it could have provoked a nuclear war.
In Moscow, the KGB received these reports, and they shared Agent Topaz's opinion about Reagan. But unlike him, they were convinced that NATO was planning an attack.
Etwa Mitte 1982 in Moscow.
In the middle of 1982, I had a private discussion with General Khrushchev. Khrushchev was very concerned by an imminent nuclear strike of NATO against the Soviet Union. He even talked about the start of a Third World War. Obviously, my question was, where did you get this information from? He remained vague. In intelligence, you never reveal your true sources.
The circle of intelligence remained unbroken. Eager to please their masters in Moscow, agents around the world continued to file their RIAN reports. Whether they were true or not no longer mattered. They only fueled the paranoia at the heart of the Soviet machine.
The RIAN program was absolutely vital because it would provide the immediate signal to the party leadership that something is about to happen.
So the government, the Politburo and all the bosses would get in their lifts very deep down under the Central Committee and the KGB buildings, catch a special train, and then go about 30, 40 kilometers to a special underground town where they would sit out the consequences of a nuclear attack on Moscow.
President Reagan also had Armageddon on his mind. He received his first briefing on the Single Integrated Operational Plan, the SIOP, which described what would happen in the event of a nuclear war.
But for the president, this being the first time he was actually exposed to these scenarios, it was a very sobering moment.
In his diary, he wrote,
"One of the first statistics I saw was the most sobering, startling I've ever heard. I'll never forget it. The Pentagon said at least 150 million American lives would be lost in a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. even if we won. And there are still some people at the Pentagon who claim that nuclear war is winnable. I thought they were crazy.
Reagan's response was to order American scientists to speed up research into his beloved Star Wars project. In the eyes of the KGB, this acceleration was yet another sign that the Americans were preparing for war. By the end of Saturday, the 5th of November, in the war game of Able Archer, the script predicted the imminent use of chemical weapons by the Soviet Union. Out in the real world, we now know that that same evening, Oleg Gordievsky received another unnerving telegram from Moscow. It contained the timetable for a Western first strike.
It can be assumed that once the preliminary decision for Rian is taken, the first strike will follow soon after, possibly 7 to 10 days.
The telegram added that the countdown had already begun. On Monday, the 7th of November, the war game of Able Archer entered a new phase. The next page of the scenario indicated that the Soviets had launched chemical weapons. This would force the players towards a nuclear response.
The idea that anyone could deviate from the exercise planning staff script is frankly bizarre, because one of the problems with exercises is if someone starts to do a bit of free play, as it's called, and actually do rather well, and maybe start to win the war, it spoils the exercise for everybody else. So everyone sticks to the script.
As the Soviet military struggled to follow the imaginary war that NATO was now fighting, new and potentially alarming news was being passed on to the KGB. Around the world, American military installations were moving onto a heightened state of alert. But this had nothing to do with imminent nuclear war. On the 23rd of October, 2 weeks before Able Archer had begun, a massive suicide bomb exploded on the US Marines base in Beirut. 241 soldiers were killed.
One of the consequences of the attack on the Marines in Beirut was a tightening of security at all U.S. facilities. And they started parking trucks next to the entrance at the White House as a barrier. We'd never been hit by a truck bomb before. Soviets would have seen the tightening of security at U.S. installations all over the world was tied to what had happened in Beirut, not to anything that was going to happen in Europe.
And as if everything that had gone before was not enough, yet another Rian indicator occurred the day after the Beirut bomb. Without any prior warning, American Marines landed on the tiny Commonwealth island of Grenada. They were there to overthrow the fledgling communist regime.
Mrs. Thatcher's reaction to the American invasion of Grenada was one of deep indignation. First of all, that she had neither been informed or consulted in advance, and secondly, that the Americans had marched into one part of the Queen's dominions without so much as a by your leave.
The invasion provoked a storm of ciphered communication between Mrs. Thatcher and the White House.
There were some extremely tetchy, not to say irritable, telephone conversations at the time. And I think, from hindsight, President Reagan probably deeply regretted that he hadn't got round to mentioning it.
To the KGB in Moscow, this barrage of communication was precisely what they expected to happen prior to a nuclear strike.
One of the things to understand about the KGB that made it different from American intelligence and for that matter from British intelligence, is that it really had no analytical capability. You had all these spies out there reporting information, and there was no one analyzing it for accuracy or whether it was real or not.
If President Reagan did intend to attack the Soviet Union, then he was going to elaborate lengths to conceal it. Early on the morning of Tuesday, the 8th of November, he set off on a trip to South Korea and Japan. He had with him the nuclear football, an 18-kilogram briefcase. This contained the launch codes to be used by the president in the event of a nuclear war. On this same morning, the war game of Able Archer entered its final phase. Having failed to contain the Soviet chemical attack, the script now demanded the use of nuclear weapons. The nuclear planners began to identify their targets.
They were exercising people like myself in making the right response, and of course we did use our actual plans.
That afternoon, the Supreme Allied Commander approved 25 targets in Germany, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. The nuclear request was immediately transmitted to London and Washington. This top-secret frequency was picked up by the listening Soviets.
Now, the question of whether the Soviets could read the nuclear release procedures is a very interesting question. We have to assume they couldn't, but it appears they reacted like a scolded cat.
Determined not to be taken by surprise, the Soviet military began to take defensive measures against Able Archer. In Eastern Europe, tanks and troops deployed to their wartime positions. Nuclear bombers were put on standby.
All the air crews were stationed right by their planes. The command came, all pilots into your cockpits, start your engines. And then we waited, either to take off or to remain in the cockpit. It was very tense, waiting for that command. Your nerves are jangling.
Up in the Baltic, the vast northern fleet prepared for imminent attack.
Our big ships, the cruisers, sailed right in close towards the cliffs, of which there were many. Because to distinguish a grey ship against a background of cliffs is extremely difficult.
Up on the edge of the Arctic, massive nuclear submarines dashed for the cover of the ice. In the event of a nuclear exchange, their intercontinental ballistic missiles would prove decisive.
It is almost impossible to find a submarine under the ice. We waited by our hull, making sure we could receive every signal, so that the time needed to make a counterstrike is as short as possible.
In the eyes of the Soviet leadership, these serious defensive measures were absolutely necessary.
On the military side, there might have been quite several dozen senior officers who believed in it. That's why they had that weight behind them to persuade the Central Committee and then the KGB, Andropov, that it was a realistic idea.
Nevertheless, they knew that the release of any nuclear weapon by the United States ultimately required the permission of the president himself. In the original script of Able Archer, Reagan was due to participate. But at the last moment, Bud McFarlane had quietly changed the plan.
Anytime we conduct an operation like that, it's watched carefully by the Soviet Union. And if you go to the point of having the principals, the decision makers actually involved, the question's raised, is this an exercise or are we not facing a possible attack? The president came around to my view that however misguided Soviet perceptions were, we shouldn't even add any possibility of their raising the stakes, and he withdrew.
With Ronald Reagan no longer involved, NATO leaders also declined to participate. Their roles were taken by military aides. On the evening of the 8th of November, they sent back the signal approving the use of nuclear weapons. To the watching Soviets, it appeared that the final piece of the jigsaw was now in place.
It was a very serious problem. Suddenly it seemed as if the Americans were just about to launch a surprise nuclear attack.
Vladimir Khrushchev had already warned that a nuclear attack might happen in the next 7 to 10 days. Now it seemed that his prediction was correct. The world was on the verge of Armageddon. That evening, Oleg Gordievsky received an extraordinary cable from Moscow.
When it was a flash telegram, it was a super urgent telegram, which is now a critical situation. The Americans exercise may be preparation to a sudden nuclear attack, watch the signs, and report immediately to us about anything unusual. How can we take such a task seriously?
The KGB sent out flash telegrams to every station in the world. They also alerted Topaz, their star agent at the heart of NATO.
The courier at first brought me the message. High alert, the Russians are really scared, they want to know everything, NATO is preparing for war. I was really upset. I was thinking, where is this leading?
Rainer Rupp was expected to give the KGB warning of the imminent attack using a special device concealed inside a calculator.
I would write my message down, I would code it, and this little machine would then condense all this into a very short sound, like a... With that, I would go to a normal telephone.
Did you send a message during Able Archer?
Yeah.
What did it say?
There was no indication that NATO was preparing for war at that time. I'm talking about NATO, I'm not talking about the United States, because they're always two quite different things.
CIA spy satellites watched these military preparations without concern. They photographed nuclear bombers alongside runways in East Germany, troops and tanks at their battle positions in Eastern Europe, Soviet submarines hiding in the Arctic ice. But they were blind to the paranoia gripping the Soviet leadership. Nor could they pick up that the most powerful weapons on Earth were poised to unleash Armageddon. In the imaginary war game of Able Archer, the script had reached the final page. Having obtained permission to use nuclear weapons, the nuclear commanders now had to wait the whole night before they were allowed to press the button.
By the time the exercise came to its fruition, it would have gone nuclear, and there's a kind of wave of rising interest and enthusiasm. When it had gone critical, we were asking for nuclear release, bang, and then we can all go home.
They were not aware that this very night was a special date in the Soviet calendar.
In November 1983, I was a captain serving in the Strategic Missile Force. Our commanders always told us that war would begin on the eve of some holiday, when people were out celebrating, when people were relaxed.
The 7th of November 1983 was Revolution Day, which began several days of celebration. In the minds of the Soviet leaders, this was their moment of greatest weakness.
We expected that at precisely that moment, the Americans might unleash the Third World War. When we reached the command bunker that night, we received a special order. We were told to immediately go to raised combat alert. It was so serious, there was a third man there with us to maintain uninterrupted communications.
Unseen by watching American satellites, over 300 intercontinental ballistic missiles prepared for a massive retaliatory strike.
The strategic nuclear forces secretly, I emphasize that it was secretly, went up to increased combat readiness. This fact was not communicated to the rest of the armed forces.
Under my command were 10 intercontinental ballistic missiles. On each missile there were 10 warheads. Each of these was aimed at a particular city, like Washington, New York, Philadelphia, and so on. The targeting was very, very precise. The devastation would have been total.
Each missile had the force of 150 Hiroshimas. And these were not the only nuclear forces preparing for war. Unseen by the West, 75 SS-20s had also dispersed into the field.
Back then, spy satellites were not powerful enough to pinpoint their locations once they were in place, and SS-20s had all sorts of camouflaging devices, so they could not be spotted by visual or radio reconnaissance.
Controlling this vast secret escalation was the chief of the army himself, Marshal Argarkov. That night, he descended into the central command bunker. Back in the nuclear vault of Able Archer, the mood could not have been more different.
I can see no reason why it would have alarmed the Soviets at all. They held their own exercises. They went through exactly the same sort of procedures as we did. And certainly, I mean, the Able Archer, I mean, it was well known. It was just a paper exercise, a command post exercise.
This was not how the Soviets saw it. Cocooned inside his hospital suite, Yuri Andropov knew that he would be amongst the first of NATO's targets.
What we in the nuclear forces feared the most was that too much time might be lost in the decision-making process. If the flying time of the Pershing was only 8 minutes, then the window in which they had to make their decision was drastically reduced.
In Soviet Russia, 3 men had the authority to launch nuclear weapons. Besides Andropov, both the defense minister and the head of the army held chegets, a Soviet equivalent to the nuclear football. These contained the launch codes to the nuclear weapons.
In the background of 1983 and the level of tensions, they really were, I think, concerned that maybe the United States was getting ready to strike.
There is one important consideration that we often forget. Remember, the Americans did use nuclear weapons once. It wasn't just a test. They destroyed 2 Japanese cities.
Throughout the night of the 8th of November, the entire Soviet war machine waited for the nuclear signal. Every event of 1983 had led up to this moment. Now, surely, the Americans would launch a nuclear attack. They had the desire, the motives, and in Able Archer, they had the perfect cover. All the Soviets could do now was wait for them to press the button, and then retaliate.
Anything could have happened. We were ready for the Third World War, if the Americans enlisted.
At dawn the following day, the Soviets intercepted the NATO signal that nuclear missiles had been launched.
We were waiting for the one most important order. That is the order to open the safe with launch codes. When you open that document, your hands are shaking. It is the most terrifying thing. If we had received the order, American missiles were already flying towards us.
The targets had been chosen. The coded messages had been sent. But the missiles remained nothing more than pieces of paper in a war game. On the last morning, 350 imaginary nuclear weapons were launched at targets in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And then, quite suddenly, the exercise ended. After all, it was the 11th of November, Armistice Day.
Can you imagine people like Andropov starting a war? How would they would spend their last month of their life in the condition of a nuclear war? Who wants to have such a disastrous, uncomfortable end of their life? It was absolutely human feeling.
I know these people personally. They would never resort to arms first. That's part of the Russian culture, which is often not properly understood in the West. We had too many wars. We lost millions of people. For us, the war is the last resort.
And Yuri Andropov was well aware that his beloved Operation Rian was still not complete.
It was just about half. So this so-called proof, it was not a proof. The proof was saying, no, there's no sign of the preparation to a nuclear attack.
No one was more relieved that it was over than the men with their fingers on the button, the Soviet missile crews.
I returned home after serving my combat duty. My wife was so pleased to see me. They were all so happy. And the very next day, we had another party to celebrate the Revolution Day holiday. In fact, even today we still celebrate it.
It was only after Able Archer had finished that the West discovered the extraordinary Soviet reaction.
I spoke to John Scarlett about everything which I experienced. I knew it was a dramatic moment. I knew Moscow was nervous. That the KGB regarded it as a folly, the KGB station in London regarded it as a folly. It didn't matter for him. It was important for him what was happening in Moscow.
This intelligence was also taken seriously by the Americans, and it was greeted with universal surprise.
The president didn't actually read each word, but he did receive from the CIA the key core issues that were exposed in Gordievsky's reports, and was very moved by them.
My first reaction to the Gordievsky reporting was not only that we might have had a major intelligence failure, but further that the most terrifying thing about Able Archer was that we may have been at the brink of nuclear war and not even known it.
Three days after the end of the exercise, The first cruise missiles arrived at Greenham Common Air Base in England. Hundreds of Pershing IIs met a similar reception in West Germany, Italy and Greece. To the protesters, nuclear war was coming closer. They had no idea just how close it had really been. For Yuri Andropov, the war scare of Able Archer was the last crisis of his leadership. 2 months later, he was dead. A year later, Oleg Gordievsky was recalled to Moscow. Realizing he was under surveillance, he contacted MI6.
Everybody during the Cold War who was in touch with the Foreign Intelligence Service, all were caught and all were shot. All.
Recognizing the danger he was in, British agents smuggled Gordievsky out over the Finnish border in July 1985.
I'm the only one of those 10 heroic officers.
You're a lucky man.
Yes, incredibly lucky. It's like a second life.
Rainer Rupp was not so fortunate. In 1993, the CIA finally caught up with Topaz.
I hurt NATO very much. In particular, I hurt the United States. And I'm still pleased that I did it.
Rupp was awarded a maximum 12-year sentence, of which he served 7.
Do you think the Americans would like you to still be in jail?
Oh, quite clearly. They would prefer not only me to be in jail, but to throw the key away.
During 1983, an accidental nuclear war between East and West almost happened. Neither side wanted it, but they did not communicate. Only the spies on opposite sides kept the peace. Ironically, the Soviet panic in November 1983 caused Ronald Reagan to change his mind. He was determined to start talking to the new Soviet leader himself. After a series of meetings, he visited Moscow in the last year of his presidency.
Do you still think you're in an evil empire, Mr. President? Say no.
It marked the beginning of the end of the Cold War.